So yesterday we focused on the history of windows, the significance, determining the significance and character, and importantly, very importantly, the setting. And then we discussed how to maintain and repair them. So today we're going to look at, firstly, we're going to look at the heat losses and drafts associated with old windows. And then we're going to look at the various ways to mitigate those. And then in the afternoon, we're going to move on and look at the option of new windows in old buildings. And if windows do have to be replaced, how those new windows should be specified. So I'm going to pass you over to Dr. Robyn Pender, who is going to do a quick recap on the previous day and also a little thinking outside of the box.
Well, sort of. Good morning, everybody. I better start by confessing that what I'm actually going to try and do over the next 31 minutes is to attempt to pull the rug out from under everyone's feet, or perhaps rather the tablecloth from under the glasses. And I'm going to do it by asking a basic question that never seems to get asked. Why exactly is it that we've been using more and more energy despite all the things we've been doing that were meant to be bringing it down? Along the way, I'm going to be challenging our current received notions around health and comfort, because as we'll see, that's been locking us into some very strange worldviews. And I think I'll be answering a few of the questions raised around yesterday's wonderful talks. And then Bill's going to take up the story to talk about what that all means for the future of windows. We could actually call our double session a window of opportunity. So let's get started. The first thing to say is I think that most of us who care about sustainability definitely feel we've crawled through into Alice's looking glass world, where everything is upside down and back to front, where the statements that get made seem to be the very opposite of reality. We keep being told old buildings are the problem, even though the problem is actually the edifice we've built by 250 years of increasingly relying on fossil fuel. And it's salutary to remember that up until the Industrial Revolution, energy was really expensive and really hard to exploit. There were some windmills and water mills for the big stuff like pumping water, grinding grain. But essentially it was all about muscle power, the muscles of our animal and our human slaves. And even emperors didn't have infinite numbers of slaves working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. After all, they had to be fed and they had to sleep. But once we'd worked out how to exploit fossil fuels, we lost complete track of reality. The average American now has the equivalent of between somewhere like 208,000 slaves working for them, and we're not far behind that in the UK. So beforehand, you didn't waste, because everybody knew exactly the effort it took to carry each bucket of water, to make every rushlight. But now we've broken the link between the energy we spend and the costs of that energy. They all seem very far away in space and time. And we're told we all need this to keep us healthy and happy. But even though we in the global north are infinitely richer than anyone could ever have dreamed of being in the past, we all seem to be pretty miserable. On the other hand, they weren't so unhappy in the pre-carbon past, and even today, the countries that are happiest seem to be those with tiny carbon footprints. So the question is that an accident, a coincidence, or is there some forgotten cause and effect going on? Well, the spoiler alert is that there almost certainly does seem to be some simple underlying reasons for that, and they all stem from the science and history we in the global north just forgot about, especially quite recently, because the key graphs are actually these ones, showing how energy and carbon use have just been going up and up despite all our sustainability initiatives, and even lockdown made barely a blip. But I think a few of us here can remember the 1960s and that life was pretty good, even though we were using so much less energy. So many things do seem really difficult and confusing now, but they take on a completely different perspective once we look at them through the twin lenses of history and science. And I really do mean science, not technology, because they're not the same thing at all, as you'll see. Now, of course, I'll be focusing on the very instructive case of architectural glazing. And what I hope to show you is that, in fact, everything we should be doing is completely logical and hangs together to benefit not just our environment, but the comfort and sustainability and usability of our buildings and our own health and happiness. Like Adam and the others yesterday, I'm going to be structuring this broadly around history, but it will be the history of energy use in building design. And it shows why glass is so central to the story of how we ended up in the looking glass world we're in and why. So to begin with, for most of history, nearly all the materials we constructed buildings out of were porous and permeable. They kept out the rain because they were like greatcoats, with the rain held in the surface pores until it evaporates and the air trapped in the pores stopping it from getting in further. Now, I'm not going to spend time today explaining about greatcoats. If you want to learn more, there are a couple of webinars I recorded a few years ago for Historic England. But the point I want to make now is that glass is not a greatcoat material. It's a raincoat, and just like a plastic mat, water collects and runs down it. And when that flowing water hits a crack or a joint, that will act as a capillary and it will suck the water through to the other side. And once it's there, that raincoat surface traps it so it can't get out again. In the global north, since the Industrial Revolution, raincoats have completely taken over from greatcoats. But the truth is that's not because raincoats work better than greatcoats. There are other things going on, as we'll see. Glass is so ubiquitous today that it's really a shock to see how late it comes into the canon of building materials. And that's simply because it takes so much energy and so much complicated technology to make sheet glass. It was a masterstroke of the medieval masons around medieval monasteries around Cologne and Liège in around 800 or 900 AD, we think. And they worked out how to cover the glass too and how to join small pieces together with lead to make large and reasonably waterproof glazed windows. But the result was so expensive that it was pretty much confined to churches for the next 500 or 600 years. To make just 1 kilo of glass, a sugar bag's worth, took the energy of an entire fully grown beech tree turned into charcoal, which meant that the glassmakers were really unpopular. They got chased from place to place, stripping the forests wherever they went. The results, though, were absolutely amazing and looking like a vision of heaven. But as the windows got larger and larger, the problems of raincoats became pretty apparent. The water running down the glazing got into the walls below and it made them wet. But the medieval master craftsmen and architects were really good at observing and learning from their mistakes. So they quickly worked out all sorts of tricks to slash the amount of rain that was hitting the glass, all those elements that characterize Gothic architecture, like hood mouldings and label stops and sills and drips. They're there primarily to keep the building dry. And it wasn't just problems with water. Glass is very responsive to temperature, as we know, so the indoor air was chilled where it touched the glass, and the cold air dropped down, making nasty drafts. But they came up with a really clever response to that too. It's just one we've forgotten about. And it's shown in lots and lots of medieval illuminations, but because it's not familiar to us, we tend not to see it until it's pointed out. They ran draperies along the bottom of the windows to catch that falling cold air, which is why medieval windows had such steep interior sills, which was something that always used to puzzle me. And you'll find draperies like this all over the world, even where you don't have glass, because they aren't just one-trick ponies. And to see how they work, though, we need to take an excursion into some important science. It's medical science, thermal physiology. It's not cutting edge in itself, but it's really only just starting to be incorporated into understanding comfort and discomfort in buildings. And it's critical to understanding our patterns of energy use. So I'm going to go into it in a bit of detail. Thermal physiology is all about how we interact with our surroundings to keep our body temperatures at the right level for metabolism. These days, when we think of thermal comfort, we're assuming it's something imposed on us from the outside and that it's all about air temperature. But this could not be further from the truth. We aren't like cups of tea, just passively losing heat into our surroundings until our skin is at the same temperature as it would be if it were just thermodynamics. Although many of the engineers and most, if not all of the modelling, does assume that's how it goes. What we are is warm-blooded animals, which means we're the heat source that counts. We evolved an incredibly complex thermoregulatory system designed to turn most of the food and oxygen that we take in into heat. Then that heat was to keep our vital organs at exactly the right temperature to work properly. Because if the brain, the heart, the lungs, and so on go outside a really narrow temperature band, it's less than a degree either way, their cells start to die, so we die too. But since we're continually generating heat, that means we always have to be losing some of it too, even when it's very cold, just not too much. So we have all sorts of clever control mechanisms for getting that balance right. And it's a dynamic balance. It's changing all the time as you move around, as your surroundings change, as you do different things. And the thermal regulation is really complex and it involves all parts of the body, but a lot of it's centered around the skin and especially the blood, which carries the heat around the body as well as the nutrients. And the reason our hands and feet feel cold in cold conditions is because they're cooling fins. The blood in them is easily chilled. And that's really good if you're too hot. But if you're losing too much heat, then what happens is the body reacts to that. By pulling the blood back from them, which is why they get so cold and why they look blue. Now, of course, exactly how we're losing our heat into our surroundings is terribly important to all of this. We lose some by touch, of course. How much depends on what we're touching and how much of our body's touching it. And we do lose some into the air, mostly by evaporation from the skin. So if you've just jumped naked and sweating out of a Finnish sauna in the middle of winter into a stiff breeze, then you might perhaps lose close to the maximum you could into the air, which is about 22% of your total heat loss. But into the indoors air, it's more like the minimum, just a few percent, even if the air's very cold or it's very drafty. So where's all the rest of it going? Well, the biggest way we lose heat by far is by radiating it out into our surroundings. That's at least 60 to 65% of our heat loss. But if we're wearing light clothing and we're surrounding by surfaces that keep absorbing our heat, it can be as much as 80 to 85%. At the moment, in the global north, we concentrate pretty much exclusively on that teeny tiny amount of heat we exchange with the air. But the radiant loss is infinitely more important for comfort. So it's really weird and really unhelpful that it's almost entirely neglected now in the way we design and the way we operate our buildings. In the past, though, because people listened to their bodies, they knew exactly how to deal with their thermal discomfort, slashing that radiant loss by just putting up simple barriers between their bodies and the heat-absorbing surfaces around them. It was usually fabric and rugs, and most seem to have been hung up in winter and then stored away again in summer when losing some heat was actually a really desirable thing. And all the screens and canopies, of course, they could be used at the same time to control air movement. And that's what's happening with those draperies that are across the windows. In winter, they're covering those massive walls, which would otherwise be absorbing body heat. And at the same time, they're catching and diverting that cold air that's coming off the glass. And there's more. Our thermoregulatory system isn't just about comfort. It turns out to be critical for health, but not in the way we generally assume. The system's just like muscles or cardiovascular fitness. It's use it or lose it. If we don't keep going in and out of different thermal conditions, the mechanism just gets lazy and it forgets what to do, and it takes a while to turn it on again. And you'll know that well if you've ever been camping. For the first day or two, you feel every change in your bones, but then you start to barely notice them. And that's not psychological, as is often thought. It's physiological. Your body's getting better at the thermoregulation again. Now, a lot of people assume that thermoregulatory capacity is lost with age, but the only age group that can't thermoregulate are premature babies. So you don't lose it as you get older, unless someone chooses to pickle you in 22 degrees, day in, day out, and then instead of making our pickled people more comfortable, what happens is their thermoregulatory systems turn off and they start getting hypersensitive to even the tiniest changes, things that beforehand their thermoregulatory systems would have just neutralized without them even noticing. And that's as true of teenagers as it is of the elderly. And there are lots of excellent researchers out there at the moment investigating this, doing wonderful stuff. But today I'd like to highlight Wouter Marken van Lichtenbeld's team at Maastricht University in the Netherlands and his co-investigator Hannu Palubinski, who's leading their work on trying to integrate thermal physiology with buildings and energy reduction. One of their most interesting projects is based on some field research Wouter did some years ago with one of his students, Delana Kovalik, who happened to have grown up in a yurt in Siberia, where her family is still living a traditional life. but some of their cousins had moved into regular housing with central heating. So the field research gave Walter and Dolana the chance to compare the health markers of both those families, and the results were unequivocal. All the health markers of the family living in the yurts were excellent, and they had much higher metabolic rates than global north people who were equivalently active. But their cousins in the housing with heating were starting to show signs of high blood pressure and diabetes. And so taking these really striking results back to the lab in Holland, Walter and his team have been working on what happens if you deliberately expose ordinary, overweight, middle-aged Dutch people to short periods of extreme cold. And what they've found is it doesn't just reduce blood pressure and obesity, but actually reverses diabetes. But I guess it shouldn't surprise us that the physiologists are finding such a strong link between tightly controlled environments and the health problems that are plaguing us now in the global north. We've got this really complex body system that's meant to be using most of the energy that we take in from the food we eat, and then we stop using it. We've actually been performing a huge experiment on ourselves over the past couple of centuries. And it all started with a bit of technology. The thermometer, which was invented in the early 18th century, and that made air temperature easy to measure. Beforehand, nobody much cared about it because from experience, they knew what was causing their discomfort and they knew how to fix it. But once people could take a reading of air temperature, the new scientists of the Enlightenment looked for ways to apply that, and that led to new theories of comfort and then all sorts of new inventions to heat and cool the air. Starting with Count Rumford's grates, which appeared at the very end of the 18th century. And these were the first fireplaces that were aimed at thermal comfort rather than cooking. After that, all sorts of patent heaters were invented, culminating in Carrier's invention of the air conditioner in 1902. And that all gave birth to a huge industry in space conditioning that still surrounds us today, with an increasing dislocation from the thermal physiology and from all the low-tech, passive ways we used to deal with thermal discomfort. And really, I'm pretty sure anyway, we don't actually want what all this tight control is supposed to deliver, a neutral thermal environment where we can't lose heat into our surroundings, because that's quickly going to make us much too hot if we start to change what we're doing. So if we get up from reading the newspaper and start doing the housework. There's been a lot of work questioning the engineering approach for a long time, looking at adaptive comfort and free-running buildings. Even in the 1960s, it had already been shown that thermal comfort was not, as everyone had been assuming, primarily about heat exchange and clothing values. Not that you'd credit that, when that's still what most people say they believe. What adaptive comfort researchers actually found was that people are comfortable around the temperatures to which they've got accustomed, whether that's a Manchester winter or a Baghdad summer. And that, of course, makes perfect sense in the light of the thermal physiology. Like beauty, comfort is actually almost impossible to describe or define, let alone put a number on it. As Bill keeps pointing out, it's actually all about avoiding crises of discomfort. Just like a boiling frog, if the conditions around us change slowly, it takes much longer for us to recognize that we're uncomfortable. But architect Lisa Heschong coined a wonderful phrase, thermal delight, to point out that change isn't all bad. It can produce pleasure, especially if it feels like it's for the better. So opening the windows, turning on a fan when you feel hot, or being able to draw the drapes and snuggle up with a heated blanket when you feel cold. In Berkeley, they've also shown that if you give people person-centered tools for making themselves feel warmer or cooler, they'll be comfortable over a vast range of air temperatures, although I do wish they could present those results without that typical recourse to air temperature equivalence, because there's so much more going on. But setting that aside, this alludes to another important thing we need to take into account, which is that people automatically feel more comfortable whenever they know they have agency, the tools to act in any crisis of discomfort and to produce an immediate benefit. And the interesting thing is just knowing you can act is sometimes all that's needed to avert that crisis. And windows are, of course, one of our most important tools for doing that. So, for example, if you're staying in a modern hotel where you can't open the windows, you're almost guaranteed to be miserable. But if you can open the window, it feels hugely better, even if you end up not actually bothering doing so. So with all that in mind, let's look again at the medieval images of draperies. And what's really striking is that the windows are usually open even in winter. You can judge that it's winter by the clothing. And we know from what people wrote too, that they really valued plenty of fresh air, certainly for their health. And in fact, one of the current big strands in thermal comfort research is all about air movement, but not just for understanding discomfort, for promoting comfort. Beforehand, all air movement was being seen as drafts and therefore something to be avoided. The best thing about the medieval people-centred sorts of comfort systems, aside from them using not much energy to make and install and absolutely none to run, is that they go right to the heart of what's actually causing thermal discomfort. You're not trying to stop radiant loss by heating all the surfaces via warm air or something, which would be horribly efficient, even if it were inefficient, even if it were possible, which it isn't really. And it's interesting to compare that observation with images showing how historically people made cosy corners for the occupants who were sitting or lying still, who were studying or so that they could feel warm without the rest of the room feeling uncomfortable for the more active people in the space. And that takes account of the fact that no building has just one use or one occupant doing the same thing all the time or feeling the same way all the time. Flexibility is key to real usability and real comfort. But enough of the comfort science. Now we need to get back to the history lens of our binoculars again and our timeline of glass, because this is where we move from stained glass to plain glass. Of course, everyone through history had always wished for a practical transparent material they could use for letting the light in while keeping the rain out. So when it was discovered that you could actually make glass with coal for fuel rather than charcoal, that changed the world overnight. I'd call glass rather than iron the first product of the Industrial Revolution. And glazed windows become more and more common, very fast, larger and larger, and building types change because of the new things glass allows them to do, like terrace houses, for instance. But I think it's really important for us to realise this wasn't just a new moment in architectural terms, it's also the beginnings of entrepreneurship and the critical role that has had on the way we construct our built environment at every level. Because we've gone from building being a local response to local needs using local materials to centralisation, where a few builders build exactly the same thing from Helsinki to Singapore using products from manufacturers' catalogues and where knowledge is siloed. The Industrial Revolution moved people from the countryside to the cities where they needed places to live and work. And so that launched a whole new world of speculative building. Skills started to be lost, and that was compounded in the First Industrial World War, when we effectively killed off in the trenches all that masters and apprenticeship system that had passed on learning from experience. And of course, this loss of knowledge was happening not just with the construction of the buildings, but with how they were being operated. And that was crucial because as glass became bigger and bigger part of the building envelope, they got new comfort problems. And again, this time, it was mostly overheating, even in the north. Solar radiation is really good at overheating occupants, and in fact, often mostly in winter when the sun's low. This is what used to happen in my old offices at Historic England at 3 o'clock. When the sun hit my back, I'd boil and I'd have to switch on my desk fan, even when it was snowing outside. You can't see the snow, but it was. And the sun also heats the glass and the surfaces, and that in turn heats the air around you. So the first thing they worked out early on as a way of dealing with this was to make glazed windows that could be opened and shut. In fact, they invented glazed shutters, but glass was still really expensive. And even when they came up with really clever brackets that could hold a casement open, there was a real risk it would slam shut in the wind and all that glass would smash. And that was serious at a time when glass was so expensive that windows were listed separately from the building for probate. The breakthrough came in the late 17th century with the invention of the mechanical, vertically sliding sash window, which didn't just make it possible to light rooms with outside windows, but even more importantly, it meant you could cross-ventilate, get rid of that accumulated air at night by opening the top sash, and the shutters came pierced, so you could do that night flushing safely. And there is still nothing better than vertically sliding sashes for pinpoint ventilation control. And it's passive too. Forget about how they look. In sustainability terms, it's criminal to swap these out for casements. We should be putting more of them in all new buildings, not taking them out of old ones. They are brilliant technology. And the other brilliant trick they invented really quickly was the awning to stop the glass heating up in the first place. And they were really simple at first, but it doesn't take long for them to become really clever and complex and ubiquitous. And then for some reason, we in the UK take them all out again, somewhere around the Second World War, perhaps because of maintenance in the buildings, have struggled ever since. Now, I'd love to see those awnings back on Buckingham Palace, and I bet the King would be happy too when he felt the difference. The loss of awnings feels a bit like the loss of the wall draperies. It looks to have had more to do with fashion and forgetting, and nothing much to do with what actually makes a building workable for the people using it. The draperies and cloths suddenly become really rare at the end of the 17th century, at least in cities, and from the date it's probably because of the link between the cloth and fleas and the plague. They'd probably have come back again, actually, but unfortunately that new fashion for bare walls and floors coincided with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, and people started assuming that old always equals bad and that they could just throw fossil fuels at every problem and get a product to sell which would make you rich at the same time. The Rumford grates were the first of the things you could buy which purported to make you feel more comfortable, and they became very fashionable. And rich people put them in every room, adding massively to London's smog, and they must have also made the houses super drafty, so even more uncomfortable. So I'm not surprised the Victorians put lots of cloth back again, especially over the windows and doors, although they seem to have thought it was just for the drafts. And then in the 20th century, out they all come again as part of the fashion for treating tuberculosis by exposure to fresh air. And this led to buildings being designed with very lightweight, open construction, lots of glazing. Instead of the windows being a small part of the envelope, they start to take over the walls, which rather overemphasizes the problems of glazing, including the fact that you radiate a lot of your heat into glass. So you're going to get immediately hot when the sun shines in, and you're going to get very, very cold when it doesn't. But unless they covered the glazing up with awnings and blinds, that really left the occupants, who'd forgotten, after all, how to sail their buildings anyway, without much way of controlling thermal discomfort except by trying to control the temperature of the air, which is, I guess, why it became such a huge business. Sue Rofe pointed out this. It's the first constitution of what would go on to become ASHRAE, and I hope they now are starting to challenge some of those assumptions, but they still do rely heavily on air temperature and the received notion that to be healthy and comfortable, you need to control it. You do see early on the physiologists trying to push back on the creep of air temperature as a proxy for comfort or health. Leonard Hill, he knew what he was talking about. Most certainly didn't pull any punches, but those were pretty powerful market forces he was up against. And what this meant was that the fresh air aspect of the new minimalism soon disappeared, and we started closing up buildings. And then when air conditioning comes into the mix, sealing up like Tupperware becomes the gold standard, despite that giving us a whole sheaf of new health problems. At the same time, on the inside, we're adding in lots of materials like plastics and solvents that off-gas, and of course gas hobs and heaters and so on, all terrible things when at the same time we're sealing up our windows. And we're so used to this, we tend to forget the health implications, and indoor air quality problems start to get really serious after the 1960s. But the big enterprises didn't like hearing this. For a long time, it was held that the link between mold and poor health hadn't been proved. And even during the pandemic, when we very quickly had overwhelming evidence that COVID was being spread by air transfer and specifically by air conditioning, that was hotly contested by the manufacturers, and even I got into trouble at Historic England by talking about it. But I think the tide is beginning to change. We can apply a little common sense to this. It's not exactly rocket science. When it comes to the failures appearing everywhere from sealing and insulating buildings, it's common to think these sorts of problems just come down to quality of materials or workmanship. But that's wrong. What we're meeting with is just the likely outcome of sealing up our buildings and adding elements that will cause moisture problems. Sooner or later, it's all going to fail, and MVHRs aren't going to save you. And let's remember that it's all because air temperature is being used as a proxy measurement for comfort and health. And that's got baked on, not just to manufacturers, not just to policymakers, but much more worryingly onto more and more of the retrofit agenda too. So it's all really a house of cards we've been building. And it's awfully worrying that the people setting up codes for comfort and health and those setting up energy policies are pretty completely unaware of any of the background science and history, which is really why Bill and I are keeping doing this, despite being superannuated. Just to remind you of those graphs showing our energy and carbon use just going up and up, despite the sustainability agenda. You know, the definition, the keeping doing the same thing and expecting a different result, isn't that the definition of madness? And air temperature hasn't been just a red herring. It's been driving some very bad behaviours on all fronts. So, for instance, I don't really think the true problem we're facing is fuel poverty. I think it's bad design and bad management and bad maintenance of buildings, coupled with all the looking glass back to front messages about what it actually takes to make occupants healthy and our buildings good spaces to live and work in. Which leads neatly onto a final question for us all. How do we start to get these critical messages about health and comfort out there and stop fighting on the enemy's ground, which is what we've been doing in conservation? It's really urgent that we get beyond preaching to the choir and start having an impact on the wider world who don't yet realise there are good reasons why it feels we're all living in a looking glass world. They don't know that building conservation with its combination of history and science has so many of the answers to the questions everyone keeps asking. I'm all sure we need all of us now, right now, to stop talking about anything and everything in terms of air temperature and start concentrating on what it is we really want to know about our buildings, which is how comfortable and flexible and usable and healthy they actually are. In other words, we need to encourage policymakers and building specialists to be willing to accept that the occupants are the only comfort sensors that have any rational meaning. We need to show everyone that when you're dealing with thermal discomfort, mostly by reducing the radiant loss and controlling drafts, then you can keep the windows and the doors open, even in winter, especially since you know that exposure makes you healthier and gets your thermoregulatory system working well, so you're going to be less prone to crises of discomfort anyway, and you'll be avoiding damp and indoor air quality problems. So when we look at the whole situation holistically through the lens of science and history, suddenly the perspective shifts and we emerge from the wrong side of the looking glass to find that we have much simpler answers to the questions that have been plaguing us. And to discuss what those might be, I'm going to hand over to Bill. Thanks very much.